Hey guys, take a moment. Let your eyes soften and your shoulders relax. Feel the hush of the room around you, the distant tick of time, the breath in your chest rising, falling. Let it all become gentle, still. Now, imagine yourself wrapped in the warmth of a woolen blanket. A small fire crackles nearby, its orange light dancing on the walls. Outside, a soft breeze rustles the ivy along a stone wall. And far in the distance, a church bell hums quietly into the night. You are safe here, and the world has slowed, just for you. Our story today begins in a time where silence spoke louder than words, a time of candlelit chapels, cloistered gardens, and hearts that burned with forbidden longings. We set sail into the Middle Ages, where saints were born from suffering, where every breath of desire was shadowed by sin, and where even in the coldest monasteries, temptation crept in like ivy through the cracks. It was the winter of 1284, in the northern reaches of England, where the days were short and the wind carried secrets through the abbey walls. Nestled deep in a forest of whispering pines stood the Abbey of St. Elareth, a monastery cloaked in snow and silence. Its gray stones were old even then, worn smooth by the feet of monks who had walked the same paths for centuries. Men who had taken vows of silence, chastity, and obedience. Yet inside each heart, something deeper stirred. Brother Alric was among them, a man of 32 winters, with a sharp mind and a gaze that lingered too long on beauty. By all appearances, he was devout, faithful, humble, obedient. But every night, as the others lay in prayer or sleep, Alric would sit by the window of the scriptorium and watch the moonlight spill across the snow and remember her face. Her name was Eleanor. She was not a noble woman nor a peasant girl. She had arrived at the abbey gates 2 springs ago, seeking refuge as a lay healer. Hair like harvested wheat, eyes the color of melted candle wax, and hands that could soothe wounds and stir hunger in the hearts of monks sworn to resist all things earthly. Alric had only spoken to her twice, but her voice still lived inside his ears, like a psalm. In the day, he prayed to forget. At night, he remembered. But Alric was not alone in his struggle. To the south, in a convent on the edge of the moors, Sister Isabel was fighting her own quiet war. Her nights were colder, the wind howled through the cracks in the dormitory walls, and her breath fogged in the air as she whispered her rosary. She too had once dreamed of love, of silken letters passed in secret, of fingertips grazing in candlelight. But now she dreamed of fire. Not the hellish kind, but the burning ache in her chest every time she looked upon Sister Madeline, whose voice made the psalms sound like poetry. In the Middle Ages, these desires had no name, no refuge. To long for flesh was to sin. To confess it was to be shamed, and to silence it was to bleed in silence. But listen now. Can you hear it? The sound of a parchment scroll unfurling, the echo of feet on stone, the hush of guilt wrapped in a monk's robe. These are the sounds of a world both distant and eerily familiar. Desire in the Middle Ages was not simply romantic. It was a test, a battlefield of the soul. The church taught that the body was a vessel of temptation, that the soul must conquer the flesh. And so, monasteries became fortresses not just of prayer, but of war. An invisible war where each thought could be a weapon, each glance a wound. Some monks beat their own backs with knotted ropes. Others slept on stone floors with no blankets, hoping that cold would drive the warmth of want from their bones. And some, like Brother Alric, simply stared at the moon and wept quietly. Because love, when forbidden, becomes sacred in its own haunting way. In the villages beyond the monastery walls, peasants whispered their own prayers. Mothers warned daughters of wandering eyes. And men sang songs at night of women with hair like gold, never admitting the weight of their own shame. But not all love was punished. Sometimes within the shadows of stone chapels, 2 hands would brush, a smile would pass, and the divine would meet the carnal in a moment no priest could name. In this world, to be human was to struggle, and to struggle was holy. Before we drift deeper into the story, take another breath. Feel your body rest. Let the candlelight in your mind flicker gently. You're not in your room anymore. You're in a time of cloisters and cold stone, of whispered prayers and hidden yearning. And our tale is only just beginning.
The Abbey of St. Elareth rose like a prayer from the earth, its narrow windows filtering moonlight into slender silver bars on the floor. Inside, in the scriptorium, Brother Alric dipped his quill into ink by candlelight, copying sacred verses from the Book of Hours. Yet every letter he wrote trembled. "Blessed are the pure in heart," he whispered aloud, as if the sound of the words might purify his thoughts. But Eleanor's memory was a living flame. There had been a moment, just one, that he relived endlessly. She had entered the garden where he sat alone one summer dusk, collecting herbs for the infirmary. Her voice had startled him. "Brother Alric, do you know the name of this flower?" He turned to find her standing near a patch of white blossoms, not dressed in finery, but in a simple gray dress, dusty from the path. Yet the light behind her had made her look as though she had stepped down from a stained glass window. He had answered her. "Woodruff," he said. "It grows in the shade, sweet when dried, bitter when crushed." She smiled. "Like most things worth knowing," she replied. And then she left. But that smile had stayed with him, like a candle that refused to die. In the convent of St. Cyra, Sister Isabel felt the same strange ache each time she passed Sister Madeleine in the cloister walk. Madeleine had a laugh that sounded like running water, soft and clean. But it wasn't her laugh that troubled Isabel. It was her silence, the way she prayed, with such focus, such surrender, as though her soul floated just above her body. Isabel, by contrast, wrestled through each psalm. She fasted often, slept little, but temptation wrapped itself around her ribs like ivy, tight and green and endless. One night, she confessed it to the Mother Abbess. "My thoughts are unclean." "All thoughts pass like clouds, child," the abbess had replied. "Only when we chase them do they become sin." But Isabel did chase them, and in her dreams, Madeleine took her hand, and neither of them wore the veil. Across the countryside, in a small village tucked beneath the hills, a baker named Tom knelt each week before the altar, his knees bruised from penance. He was a widower, young and handsome. But the church women spoke in low tones about the miller's daughter, who visited his shop more often than bread was needed. Sin in those days lived in rumors. A glance held too long. A touch not meant. A heart that fluttered when it should have stood still. In royal courts, the game was more subtle. Desire there wore perfume and pearls. Kings took mistresses in secret chambers, and queens wept in silence behind velvet curtains. They too attended mass. They too crossed themselves, and behind closed doors they burned with the same fire. For no one, not even royalty, could escape the pull of the flesh. And yet, amidst all this struggle, the church held tightly to its belief. That desire could be beaten into silence. That suffering could cleanse the soul. That holiness was the absence of longing. But even the saints had trembled. It is said that Saint Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism, once threw himself into a thorn bush to rid himself of impure thoughts. Saint Margaret of Cortona, wept for years over her past as a nobleman's mistress, believing every kiss had marked her for damnation. Yet through their pain, they found light, not because they never desired, but because they never stopped seeking something greater than desire. Desire was not the enemy, it was the trial. And trials are how the soul learns to sing. The moon has risen higher now, its light falling through the clouds like spilled milk across a dark sky. The abbey bells are silent, the nuns have gone to bed, the baker's hearth glows low, and the monks, some of them sleep, some pray, and one still sits by his window, watching the stars and whispering a name he never should have spoken. Let your body grow still again. You are not in the 21st century anymore. You are where stone corridors echo with footfalls of men at war with themselves, where candlelight flickers over manuscripts that try to save the soul, where love wears the mask of shame, but never truly dies. A frost settled gently over the fields. The breath of winter kissed the grass silver, and the monastery bells tolled lauds. The morning prayer. Brother Alric rose before dawn, his mind fogged with dreams he dare not speak of. He washed in freezing water, wrapped his robe tight, and walked in silence to the chapel with the others, their heads bowed beneath the soft golden light of oil lamps. The chant began, low, slow, ancient. Ubi caritas et amor. Where charity and love are. He sang the words, but in the corners of his mind, Eleanor's smile flickered like a flame refusing to go out. In the convent, Sister Isabel was already awake. She had not slept at all. Her hands were red with cold from tending the herb garden before sunrise. Punishment, voluntary, necessary. She had watched Sister Madeleine from a distance that morning. The other woman's breath curled visibly in the air, but her face was calm, radiant even. Isabel had once tried to imagine what it would feel like to place her hand over Madeleine's heart, to feel whether it beat fast or slow, whether the other woman, too, struggled, but she never dared ask. Instead, she turned her pain into prayer, knees raw, lips cracked from whispered confessions, and always, the same question rose. Why did God give us longing if he meant for us to cast it away? In the nearby village, the baker Tom stood at his oven, face lit orange by the flames. The miller's daughter, Anna, had come that morning, brought wheat, stayed too long. She always smiled too warmly, asked about his bread, leaned too close. He never touched her. He never would, but he dreamt, and he hated himself for it. That night, as snow fell soft outside his cottage window, he sat with a rosary in hand and whispered not prayers, but apologies. Desire, in the Middle Ages, was not only forbidden, it was feared. The Church spoke of the 7 deadly sins, and at the heart of them all was pride. But close behind it, slipping through the cracks, was lust. Men were taught that women tempted by nature. Women were told their thoughts must be bridled like horses, and yet the body did not always obey. But in secret corners of parchment, monks wrote of visions. The temptation of Saint Anthony, where demons came in the shape of women, where virtue was tested by dream. One nun's diary spoke of a vision she had in her cell, an angel and a devil, both whispering in her ear. One told her to suppress, the other told her to feel. She awoke in tears and never spoke of it again. In cloister gardens, among the roses and rosemary, passions bloomed quietly. A brush of cloth, a shared hymn book, a glance that lasted just a moment longer than it should have. It was not always love. Sometimes it was hunger. Sometimes it was curiosity. But always, it was human. And because it was human, it was holy and terrifying. Brother Alric had begun fasting longer. He avoided the herb house where Eleanor often passed. But temptation is not always external. He began to see her in verses, in the space between lines, in the rhythm of prayers. And when the other monks knelt in prayer, Alric bowed lower than all, not from humility, but from shame. Sister Isabel, too, had taken on penances. She walked barefoot in the snow to the chapel before the bells. She refused butter and warmth. But Madeline's voice lingered in the Psalms, a soft, rising melody that pierced like sunlight through stained glass. One evening, Isabel dropped her prayer beads. Madeline bent to help her pick them up. Their hands touched. It lasted less than a second, but for Isabel, the heat of that touch echoed through her for days. There were stories. Whispers passed from nun to nun, monk to monk, of those who had broken their vows. A friar and a nun who ran away to live in the woods. They built a hut, lived as man and wife, were hunted by the church, captured and separated. Some say they were forced into lifelong silence. Others say they still visit each other's dreams. These stories were warnings and lullabies and silent prayers all at once. Even the holiest struggled. Saint Teresa of Avila spoke of divine ecstasy, of an angel piercing her heart with fire. Her writings are still debated today. Were they spiritual, or something deeper, or both? Desire and holiness are not opposites. They are two flames flickering in the same soul. Now breathe again. Let your body soften. Let the hush of the past cradle you. You are not alone. You are not strange. Even in the still, cold halls of 13th century monasteries, hearts beat with the same tremble as yours. The monks, the nuns, the villagers, the queens, they were not pure marble statues. They were clay, like you, and from that clay, God-shaped longing. We have wandered far into the chambers of shadow and soul. The snow falls heavier now. The candles burn lower, and yet the story is far from over. By the time spring thawed the snow outside the Abbey of St. Elerith, Brother Alric had begun to feel like two men stitched into one body. One knelt at prayer, fingers folded, lips dry from fasting. The other watched Eleanor's shadow pass through his memory like stained light through water. He told himself, God sees the heart, God forgives the struggle. But in the silence of his cell, he feared that even his breath betrayed desire. He had once copied a sermon by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. The soul that loves, loves purely, even when it fears. That line returned to him often, like a boat bobbing back to shore after each storm. Eleanor had left the abbey by Lent. She had finished her service in the herb house, returned to her village, and left behind a silence heavier than scripture. For weeks after, Alric's prayers grew longer, more desperate. He begged for forgetfulness, for indifference. But longing has roots, and hers had gone deep. One night, alone in the chapel, he opened a psalter and wept into its pages. His tears spotted the parchment. His guilt, inked in salt. In the convent of St. Cyra, Sister Isabel's torment had deepened. It was not the thoughts that shamed her, but the fact that they returned even after prayer. Madeline had spoken to her, briefly, after Compline one evening. You sang beautifully today, she had said, smiling gently. Isabel's breath caught in her chest. Thank you, she whispered, then walked away quickly, afraid her voice might betray the shaking inside her. That night, Isabel wrote a letter. To no one. A confession without a confessor. She wrote of the ache in her chest, of dreams too soft to speak aloud. She folded the paper and burned it in her candle flame, watching the ashes scatter like black petals. Elsewhere, in castle halls and rural cottages, others faced quieter battles. A knight, long returned from the Crusades, struggled to be tender with a wife he barely knew. She, too, prayed in secret, not for him to change, but for her heart to open. In a nearby town, a young girl confessed to her priest that she had felt her body warm when she saw the blacksmith's son. She was 12. The priest scolded her, and the girl learned to fear her own skin. In the Middle Ages, there was no language for desire that wasn't tinged with warning, no sanctuary for hearts caught between devotion and human need, no softness in the scripture for those who trembled. But even still, even in the dark corners of manuscript margins, there were signs of love. One monk, whose name was never recorded, left a tiny poem in the edge of a copied sermon. Though I vow silence, my heart still sings, not for the world, but for the one who smiled beneath the willow. It was never discovered by his abbot, but centuries later, when the manuscript was restored in a library in Oxford, a scholar found it and cried without knowing why. Not all struggles were punished. Some became saints. Saint Dymphna, who fled an unwanted union and chose a life of solitude. Saint Clare, who turned away from nobility and comfort to live in holy poverty. Saint Mary of Egypt, once a courtesan, who wandered the desert in repentance and found peace. Each of them wrestled, each of them yearned, and through that yearning, found holiness. Let us return to the abbey now, to Alric, who stood in the cloister one dawn, watching the mist rise from the earth. He no longer prayed to forget. He prayed instead for meaning in the remembering, for the chance to serve, to breathe, to carry this desire not as shame, but as a cross, a holy burden, a reminder of his humanity. Sister Isabel began writing hymns, soft melodies, no names, just longing in musical form. She sang them beneath her breath during morning work, and the other sisters began to hum them too, never knowing what ache had birthed them. Madeline never asked. But one day, she placed a sprig of lavender in Isabel's hand as they passed in the cloister walk, said nothing, and smiled. Desire is not always resolved. Sometimes it is transformed into music, into prayer, into a quiet vow made to oneself in the cold hush of dawn. In every age, the heart longs. In every soul, there is a door that opens into hunger and hope. Even among the walls of monasteries and convents, where silence reigned and flesh was shamed, even there, the whisper of love never fully vanished. It simply changed its shape. Take one more deep breath. Can you hear the wind outside the chapel? The creak of wooden beams above your bed? The low murmur of monks chanting just beyond the veil of sleep? They too once closed their eyes with longing, still burning in their chests, and they survived it. Would you like to drift further into their world? There is more to tell, more hearts to hear. Time passed. Spring turned to summer, and the abbey garden filled with life again. Mint, thyme, violet, sage. The air smelled of growth and wet soil. Brother Alric no longer sought to forget Eleanor. Instead, he had begun to understand. His love for her had not been evil. It had not broken his vow. It had only revealed something about his soul, that he was capable of tenderness, and perhaps that tenderness itself was not a sin. He still rose before the bells, still copied scripture, still walked the cloisters in silence, but there was a new softness in his face. He helped the younger monks learn their Latin. He sang more fully during Vespers, and when he saw a new servant girl arrive at the abbey gate, he bowed his head and offered her a blessing without letting his thoughts wander. His struggle had become a kind of quiet strength, not because he conquered desire, but because he accepted its presence and chose stillness over shame. In the convent of St. Cyra, Sister Isabel's songs were now sung by 3 other nuns during evening prayers. No one knew who had written them. She never said. But every note carried a message, that longing could live inside devotion and not destroy it. She still thought of Sister Madeleine, but the ache had changed. It was no longer sharp. It was a memory, a wound that had closed, but left behind a delicate scar in the shape of music. Far beyond the convent walls in the village, Baker Tom had finally spoken to Anna. She had come in once again near closing, holding her basket of wheat like always. But instead of rushing her out, Tom asked her about her family. They spoke of the weather, of the wheat harvest, of the smell of summer on stone. He still felt his heart tremble when she laughed, but he did not scold himself that night. Instead, he thanked God that something in him still responded to beauty. Desire was not always about bodies. Sometimes it was about being seen, about hearing one's name spoken kindly, about feeling that, in all this cold stone and silence, your heart still beat. And in the higher halls of the church, even the learned men who wrote great sermons sometimes paused between ink and parchment and sighed, because they too remembered. A voice, a touch, a dream they once had, before the robes, before the weight of vows. The Middle Ages were filled with saints, but also with sinners trying their best. And most people were both. There is a record, tucked away in a forgotten church archive, of a letter written by a monk to a woman he once loved. The letter was never sent. It was sealed, stored beneath sermon scrolls, found only centuries later. It read, "I remember your laugh more than your face, your hands more than your words. And though I am his now, know that your name still lights a lamp in my soul when the nights are long." The monk never left his order, but that lamp, it burned till the end. So many lamps, still burning. So many hearts, still torn between flesh and spirit, still aching in sacred ways. You see, desire was never the enemy. It was the doorway, a reminder that we are not statues carved in stone, but living, breathing souls, meant to feel, to ache, to reach, to struggle. And in that struggle, to rise. Let the hush fall again. Let the abbey walls grow dim. Let the sound of the psalter fade. You are lying in a bed that is no longer just yours. It could be a monk's cell, a nun's quiet chamber, a village cottage near a glowing hearth. You are not alone. They are all around you. The broken, the faithful, the longing, the hopeful. In this silence, you are part of their story, and they are part of yours. Now, if you're ready to dream beneath cloistered stars, I can guide you deeper still. We can explore what happened to the runaway lovers, the abbess who once bore a secret, and the mystery of the chapel hidden in the woods. In a forgotten corner of the northern forests, hidden behind tangled bramble and ivy, stood the ruins of an old stone chapel. Locals called it the Chapel of the Wild Vow. No one knew who had built it. No bells, no records, no saints painted on its walls. But within those stones lingered a legend of two lovers once vowed to God who fled their orders and disappeared into the woods. She was a nun, he a friar. Their names have been lost to time, but the story, it stayed. They had fallen in love not in rebellion, but in reverence. Their love, it is said, began not with touches, but with shared prayer. Long evenings in candlelit libraries, debating scripture, gently arguing the meanings of psalms, and in between, a glance held too long. One night, they vanished, left behind their robes, their books, even their shoes. Some believed they had died in the forest. Others claimed they had built a home of sticks and stone, a place where they worshiped together, outside the church's eye, but not outside God's gaze. Pilgrims who wandered deep enough into the trees sometimes found the chapel. They said there were carvings in the stone, not Latin, but love poems. A scholar once wrote them down. "I loved thee not as flesh, but as flame. You were the prayer I spoke without breath. Where your hand rests, the spirit lives." The church never recognized them, but lovers did, and lonely souls, and those who had never fully fit within rules built by others. Not all love ends in exile, but even when it does, it leaves a sanctuary for others. Back at the Abbey of St. Elerith, Brother Alric had heard of the chapel once, from an old monk who told the tale with a mixture of scorn and awe. Alric never saw it himself, but in his dreams, he imagined it, covered in moss, warmed by fireflies, filled with silence that wasn't empty, but sacred. One summer afternoon, while walking the cloister alone, he saw a young monk watching a girl deliver supplies at the gate. The boy turned away quickly, flushed and ashamed. Alric paused beside him. "It's all right to feel," he said softly. "The test is not in the feeling, but in what you choose after." The boy nodded, eyes wide, and Alric realized he had become what he once needed, a voice of grace in a world of punishment. In the convent, Sister Isabel had written a final song. It had no words, only soft humming and the slow rhythm of footfalls on stone. The melody drifted out the open window one warm evening, and a girl in the village walking barefoot near the convent wall heard it. She stopped, closed her eyes, and smiled. Desire does not end, it transforms. What begins as ache can become art. What tempts the soul can also teach it. Even the deepest longing, if carried gently, can lead us closer to the divine. In that era of stiff robes and whispered confessions, where saints trembled and sinners prayed, there lived people who were not one or the other, but both. People who learned that sometimes to love is to suffer, and to suffer is to understand. There is an old psalm that says, "My soul thirsts for you in a dry and weary land." Maybe that thirst is what desire truly is, not for skin, not for lips, but for connection, for presence, for something that says, "You are seen, you are not alone." And so even now, as you lie beneath your blanket, the shadows of history brushing the edges of your sleep, you carry the same longing they did, and you are no less holy because of it. Let your breath soften. Let your thoughts float like ashes above the altar. Let the scent of lavender and old parchment wrap around your mind. You are in the abbey still. You are walking the garden paths with bare feet. You are praying not to forget, but to be at peace with remembering, desire, sin, struggle, and beyond them, grace. It's all part of the same sacred tapestry, woven not in gold, but in the quiet ache of the human heart. Years passed. The chapel in the woods remained, more myth than memory. Vines wrapped its arches like fingers in prayer. Its silence grew heavier, not with forgetting, but with sacred patience. In a town many miles away, a girl named Mira worked at a candlemaker's shop. She knew little of abbeys or theology. She only knew the feeling that rose in her chest each time she saw the priest's apprentice gathering wax and wick. He never said much. He always paid in coins polished smooth by anxious fingers. But once he left behind a scrap of parchment with only 2 lines written on it. "My prayers are smoke, and you, the spark." Mira kept the parchment hidden in the lining of her apron. She never told anyone, but that night she began lighting 2 candles instead of 1. One for the saints, and 1 for him. In the monastery, Brother Ulrich was aging. His hands ached, his spine bowed, but his voice grew softer and somehow clearer. He was known now as the monk who listened. Young brothers came to him with trembling voices and guilty hearts. One wept over dreams he couldn't control, another over songs he hummed that were not part of the liturgy, and Ulrich, who had once feared his own longing, now offered them this: not every fire must be put out. Some must simply be held gently, so they don't burn down the house. In her final years, Sister Isabel became the abbess. Her rules were not harsh. She left more time for walking the gardens, for painting, for silence. When asked why, she simply said, "God speaks softest in stillness." And when a novice confessed that she loved another sister, Isabel said, "Then love her well, without harm, without hiding, and always with reverence." Not everyone approved. Some whispered, some warned, but others found peace in the way Isabel led, not by law but by light. In time, stories of the Wild Vow Chapel spread further, not through sermons, but through song. Minstrels sang of the nun and the friar, of a love that honored both body and soul, of a ruin in the woods where ivy carved their names in green. Pilgrims still wandered there, not to find saints, but to remember that they were still human and still worthy. And somewhere, in a warm stone convent, a new novice wrote in her journal, "I don't know if I want to be a bride of Christ or if I want to love like the nun who ran into the forest. Either way, I think he'll understand." Outside the monastery, the world changed. Kings rose and fell, laws shifted, Wars burned and faded. But the chapel? The chapel remained. Not untouched, but unforgotten. One stormy evening, a lone traveler sought shelter in the ruin. He found only moss and silence, and a soft patch of stone carved faintly with ancient words. Where there is longing, there is life. He wept, not for love lost, but for love remembered. And so, dear listener, as you lie now in the hush of your own quiet chamber, know this: you are not the first to ache, you are not the first to yearn, and you are not alone. Your desires, strange, tender, fierce, or fearful, do not make you broken. They make you alive. Let yourself drift now. Let your breath be slow. Let the candles of your mind flicker in the breeze of old stories. Somewhere, the chapel still stands, even if only in you. They say the wind still hums through the ruins, soft as a psalm, gentle as a secret. And if you sit still, truly still, you might hear laughter, or weeping, or both braided together like candle smoke and dusk. Isabel's grave is unmarked, as she wished, but nearby, a vine-covered stone bears one carved sentence: "Let love be quiet, let it be kind." And Alric? His voice never left. It lives in every cloistered whisper that dares to speak truth, and in every trembling hand that reaches out instead of retreating. He taught one final thing, scrawled into the margin of a borrowed psalter: the friar and the nun. Their names were never officially recorded, but their story, oh, the story endured. Because stories like theirs don't vanish. They become myths, they become songs, they become questions whispered under breath by candlelight. Even now, somewhere, a young boy sits alone in a cathedral pew, wondering why his heart beats differently. A girl kneels beside her bed, asking why she dreams of soft hands and stolen glances. So, dear one, if ever you feel torn between what is sacred and what is human, know this: they were never meant to be apart. Your hunger, your tenderness, your tears, your warmth, they are not sins. They are signs. Signs that you were made not just to worship, but to feel. Not just to kneel, but to love. Let the candles dim now. Let the chapel doors close gently behind us. You are safe. You are sacred. You are soft and strong and seen. Thank you for wandering through time with me tonight. Sleep now, like parchment resting under moonlight. And if you dream of forests and love that waits in ruins. And yes, like this video and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video, from which city or village. Good night, traveler, and may even your longing be blessed.